Well, we're going to go ahead and get started since it's 12:02 and I want to be respectful of your guys' time. What we did this last year is we broke out our flood coverages into different segments when it comes to commercial insurance. So we did previously a class on commercial insurance, specifically just commercial properties. And then Courtney had done one on condo properties, which was great. The condo policies can be a little bit more complicated. And then we broke this one out to talk about farm, ranch, agricultural buildings, all of that stuff right now. So this is for those of you that do write more farm policies. And so though the commercial coverages are covered under the same forms, this class will specifically address stuff that's agricultural and farm ranch. If you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself, or you can always stick it in the chat. Carrie will go ahead and chime in with your questions that are in the chat when we do have a break in the material, and then we can answer that for all of you to hear. But do not hesitate to unmute yourself and talk if you would like to. I love this group that you have already done that. That's not really common all the time when it comes to Zoom. We usually get radio silence. I'd like to talk about our agenda for today. So we're going to discuss agricultural damage from flooding. We're going to discuss the different NFIP policies that you're going to be using to write these different coverages. We're going to talk about eligibility for certain structures and coverages that are available within the policy. So we want to start out with just some statistics. Farm ranch, it's a big exposure. There's a lot of opportunity when it comes to farm ranch. I know it's a more difficult policy to write. I didn't even give you guys my background, but I have been a trainer for a while in insurance, and I've trained for both Allstate and American Family on the agency side. So I'm really familiar with, writing your P&C and life and health and what you have there. And I've taught on farm ranch from the P&C side. And I know that it was a lot to learn in the different structures, and we take everybody out on farms because that was the easiest way for us to really be able to point out all the different structures and what the liabilities were and what the risks were and all that good stuff. So I know that it can be more complicated. And when we're talking about it here, we're talking about the exclusions that you have in those farm policies when it comes to flood. And then how do you get the coverage for them? Because flood can be pretty catastrophic. So in the statistic that you see on the slide here, according to the USDA, nearly 20 million acres of farmland went unplanted due to heavy rains across the nation. A flood is the costliest natural disaster, and it affects the greatest number of people worldwide. They have caused the largest portion of insured losses among all natural catastrophes in recent decades. So flood is definitely our largest loss. From 1980 to 2013, floods caused over $1 trillion in damage globally. And in 2016 alone, the damages were estimated to be over 60 billion. We do know that the agricultural sector is particularly vulnerable to floods, and floods can inundate farmlands and cause major damage to crops. And having coverage for those is just so important. So we wanted to talk a little bit about some examples of agricultural damage from flooding. So regardless if you have a flood policy or not, there's not always coverage. And what we want to be thinking about is if we know all these different risks that come from flooding, and you look at these risks, do they have coverage within their regular farm ranch policy or their blanket farm policy, or do they need coverage within a specific flood policy, a separate flood policy? And if it's not covered under the flood policy, do you need a special policy? And then would you need to be looking at that? So just kind of thinking about the whole big picture, the package of a farm ranch policy and all the different facets of it. So for example, federal crop insurance has very limited coverage for flood loss, and that's something that is important to know about. So we've got some things on here like a flood can destroy the crop and livestock. It can contaminate the water supply with sewage backup or agricultural chemicals. It can ruin hay stores and food grains, damage farm equipment and machinery, damage farm structures, create a big problem with livestock disease and even death and drowning, and interrupt transportation of feed and supplies. just to name a few. We want to talk a little bit about some damage that has resulted in recent years from a flood. And so we've got 4 different hurricanes up here that had a significant impact when it came to agricultural land. I do have a little bit of information about each of these storms when it comes to flooding, and I'm not going to try and inundate you guys with numbers, but the economic impact of the Hurricane Florence in North Carolina was $2.4 million. It does break it up out there when you look at the storm. It breaks it out with what was covered under federal, private, and state sources, what was not covered, the gap that was there. The unmet agricultural impact in Hurricane Florence was $2.2 billion that was not covered under anything else. And so you see when I'm talking about $2.4 billion, and then what was unmet. When we talk about, and it also goes on to talk about the different aspects that had incurred different losses. So you had crop and livestock losses, which was $1.1 billion, $9.7 million in grower association losses, $20 million in emergency livestock disposal. And it goes on to list a lot of the other ones. Hurricane Katrina, it had $882 million in total crop, livestock, and agricultural losses. Hurricane Sally, it had high winds combined with more than 20 inches of rain that really affected Okaloosa County. I don't ever know if I say that right. And that one took its hardest hit with cotton crops. They were said to have lost about 50% of their yield that year. And then we've got Hurricane Dorian, which had some devastating effects in Central Florida, significant acreage that's devoted to citrus, vegetable, ornamental plants, and cattle production. So when we look at the NFIP and where you do have flood insurance coverage, we do have 3 different forms that you could write flood coverage in. So the NFIP only has 3 forms, which makes it kind of easy that you don't have to learn, 20 different forms, but everything can be written within these 3 forms. And then we have to decide which form you're going to use to write that specific coverage. The first thing that we have is the dwelling form, and the dwelling form is used for residential properties, your dwelling. The general property form is what we will use to write these agricultural properties as well as commercial properties. And then you've got the RCBAP, which is your residential condo policy. Residential Condo Business Association policy. All right, and so you saw that we had a little box that came up for the NFIP forms. When we're talking about agricultural coverage, you're going to be talking about the dwelling and the general property form, and I'll explain to you why. Agricultural exposures are not only, when you have an agricultural business, you're also going to, most of the time, they also have their residents on the same land, and so you're going to have a couple of different policies that you're going to be writing there. So we do talk about farm ranch exposures here. The first one we're going to talk about is your residential exposures. So as I mentioned before, most of the time the owner is going to have their residence on the property. With flood insurance, there can be multiple structure types that are on one property. So you can have a residential property that's written with your dwelling form, and then you can have some of your agricultural buildings, which are written with your general property form. A thing I want to point out real quick is those of you that write a lot of flood insurance already know this, but it is 1 building per policy with the NFIP. And so with this, you would be writing several different policies depending on how large the farm was and all of the different structures that were on it. The residential dwelling would be written with the dwelling form, as you see on the screen there. And the residential building has a $250,000 maximum, $100,000 max on content, and it pays out at ACV with built-in RCV provision. So the built-in RCV provision for replacement costs is that they have to live there 80% of the time and have full coverage of their property or the maximum for the building. So if the building is valued at $350,000, they do have to carry the maximum $250,000 for that replacement cost value to kick in. All right, and now we look at some of the farm ranch exposures that are non-residential. So it can be multiple structures, and I apologize, you guys. I'm gonna stick in farm ranch all the time because that's what my mind always goes to, having come from companies that use that term a lot. You've got farm ranch exposures and agricultural buildings. And when I'm talking about those, I'm really talking about the same thing. When I was talking with an agent yesterday, they were saying when they think of farm ranch, they think of these structures. And when they think of agricultural, they think of more of crops. And that's kind of where my mind goes. But there are, within the NFIP, it is defined as agricultural buildings. So the exposures that you have that are non-residential are all these other types of structures that nobody lives in. So the only one that we're writing under the dwelling is the actual home. Then you've got to look at the general property form for the rest of the stuff that we're going to be addressing. We do see here that you see on the screen that there's other non-residential and non-residential. So within the NFIP, agricultural structures are specifically considered other non-residential. That's how it defines them. And they're written using the general property form. And the general property form is used for anything that is not lived in. The general property form for other residential and non-residential has a building maximum of 500,000, a content maximum of 500,000, and it is always paid out at actual cash value. There isn't a replacement cost value available for these policies. Now, I talked about other non-residential, and so within the NFIP, it defines agricultural buildings as other non-residential. But you may have some non-residential buildings that are there too, which are more commercial buildings. So maybe you have a farm stand store that is a structure that is eligible. So maybe you have a type of store that is on the property where you sell fruits and vegetables or something like that. That's when you would have a non-residential building defined as non-residential within the NFIP. I hope that makes sense. So insurance coverage from floods on a farm it's a mixed bag, and there are so many different aspects of the farm that are easily covered, but then there's other major components that need some special attention to be covered for floods. The property can extend over multiple flood zones, and this can make it a little bit more challenging. The zone that you use for the policy is going to be the zone that the structure is in. So with these policies, it's, you can't just run a zone determination and know exactly where it's going to fall. Many times the agent is just going to enter the address in for the property, and a lot of times it's not even recognized. So what happens if you do that is then the mapping company would reach out to you and request more information. What you can do to expedite this process is reach out to us at NFS. You can talk to underwriting, and for large parcels of land, you need to let us know that you need to have the property mapped. And so what we'll usually do is have you pull up the property on Google Earth and then start circling and numbering the structures that need insured. And then we'll be able to say, okay, this structure is in this zone and this structure is in this zone, or maybe they're all in the same zone. And then you would know exactly how it needs to be written. They'll do a map overlay and identify where the structures are and the zones that they're located in. If there ever is a situation where a home straddles 2 or more flood zones, the insurer, it would be rated as the most hazardous zone. But usually what happens here is you're going to have a building that may be located in this zone, and then another agricultural building that's located in a separate zone with some of these properties. They also have multiple structures. So you have barns, livestock storage, multiple homes possibly. With the flood policy, it is again one policy per structure. So you could be writing multiple policies with this and making sure that you know which ones have coverage and in which ones that you can write, and then going ahead and providing the coverage for them. Sometimes there is no address for these properties, and it's difficult to pinpoint the structure there. And that's when it's great to get us involved and to help alleviate any frustration that you'll feel trying to go at it on your own. All right, low flood zones are at risk too. So we always tend to have our flood zones in our PowerPoints because it's such an important part of rating. I mean, it's one of the biggest parts of rating for flood policies. And we know that our high risk flood zones are zones A and zones V. But we have seen a lot of flooding that occurs outside of those high risk zones, especially when it comes to agricultural properties, and they can be located in zones that are considered low risk. So in the examples here, you see the Atlantic coast picture for your high risk zones, but then you see in these low risk zones a place like Nebraska that can have substantial flooding. So just because that person is located in a low flood risk zone doesn't mean that they don't need flood insurance. And I think that this is super important when it comes to agricultural properties, because the loss that they can incur as a result of a flood is significant, and it could have a huge impact on them and their livelihood. But we want to talk a little bit about community participation. So structures that are eligible for coverage must be located in a participating community. And so when we talk about the participating community, it goes back to the National Flood Insurance Act of 1968. And what happened is then, you know, FEMA did all the mapping and they developed, they saw where there was adequate, what they did is they made sure that as a public, you can participate in making sure that you can mitigate risk in your area. And that's when you participate in these communities. And if you're a participating community, then you can be written under the NFIP. So there are a couple of different things that you will see with participating communities, but structures are eligible for coverage if they're located in a participating community. If they're not located in a participating community, they can always seek out the community and see if they can become a participating community. And if they aren't, or they were and they're no longer eligible, then it wouldn't be able to be written under the NFIP. To see if the property you're quoting is in a participating community, you can visit the link that you see there on the screen. After the webinar, we will send out a copy of this PowerPoint so that you can have access to all this information, and you'll have access to that link as well. And that link is used not just for agricultural properties, but all properties, to see if it's in a participating community. When it comes to coverage under the NFIP, one of the most important things to do is to know the definition of a building, because that is how you determine if it's eligible and if it will have coverage. So a building has to have at least 2 or more outside rigid walls. It has to have a fully secured roof. It has to be affixed to a permanent site. So like when we think about that, a lot of times I think about mobile homes and if they're affixed to a permanent site or not. And it has to have at least 51% of M&E above ground level. So the machinery and equipment has to be at least 51% above ground level. So let's talk a little bit about what's eligible and what is not eligible. So I'm going to have Carrie go ahead and do a poll question here. And if you guys could go ahead and answer, which one of these do you think is eligible? We've got a chicken coop, a residence, a pig pen, and stables. And then you've got your options on the screen. So go ahead and I'll give you a couple of seconds to put in what you think. Carrie, let me know when.
Yes, we've got about a little more than half of the attendees have voted, and I'll share the results as well. Everyone's doing great. We just have a couple more. If you want to go ahead and vote, we can give it like 10 more seconds.
Butt dial again. Oh, man. My answer is a butt dial.
Your answer is a butt dial. So do you think that that answer was right? It looks like it probably was. All right, we have the results here, and 100% of you say B and D are eligible buildings. That's very nice because you guys are correct. So let's talk a little bit about what's eligible and not eligible. So in the NFIP, it defines an agricultural structure as a structure that's used exclusively in connection with the production, harvesting, storage, raising, or drying of agricultural commodities. When we think about eligibility for these buildings, the first thing that we want to do is we want to think back about that definition of a building. Does it have 2 or more outside rigid walls? Is it fully secured roof? Is it affixed to a permanent site, and does it have at least 51% of the M&E above ground level? In addition to that, though, the NFIP specifically defines some structures that are covered, that are agricultural structures. So it specifically says that there is coverage for grain bins, farm structures, and buildings. I take that back, I'm sorry. Grain bins, farm structures, and buildings are typically not covered by your farm blanket policy because of the flood exclusion. But then we've got the NFIP that specifically includes these structures. So it lists items such as sheds, barns, silos, grain storage buildings, grain bins, agricultural or industrial processing facilities, and other farm buildings. Container type buildings are not an eligible structure. So here you see you've got your farmhouse, your residence that's eligible. You got your barn, your detached garage, your silos, your shed, and your stable. They all meet the definition of the policy. The silos are a little bit different, but again, they're specifically defined in the policy as having coverage. And then over here under not eligible, you see that you've got your hay barns, your chicken coop, and your pig pen, which are ineligible under the definition of what's a covered building. If ever you are not sure if that structure is covered or not, if it's out of the ordinary, you can always send photos and we can let you know if it's eligible or not eligible, or if you can define it, then we can go ahead and assist you with that. So if there ever is a question and it doesn't have an easy answer, that it doesn't fit into these categories, call us and we'll go ahead and walk you through that and let you know if you can have coverage under the NFIP or not. So let's talk about what's covered for contents and what's not covered for contents. So examples of eligible contents include stuff like equipment, self-propelled vehicles, or machines that are not licensed for use on public roads and used to service the described location. So those are covered. They're farming equipment that's not licensed for use on public roads. You also have on here that, one of the things that you want to keep in mind is if you have like a trailer, then you're going to have comprehensive vehicle coverage under your auto policy. Other things like your large farm equipment, such as your tractors, they're usually going to be covered from flooding under your farm blanket insurance policy, but they're not going to fall into coverage under your NFIP. A lot of times they fall into that farm insurance blanket policy, but you have to have that special risk endorsement. Again, we will cover, the NFIP will cover farming equipment that's not licensed for use on public roads, but used to service the property, and it has to be in an eligible building. And so those things all have to apply. So contents that are located in silos, grain storage buildings, and cisterns are also covered. And the NFIP provides building coverage or content coverage for agricultural risks such as stock, inventory, or other commercial contents. I'm sorry, I flipped. Hold on guys, I'm sorry, let me take you back. So when we look at this picture here, you've got your farming equipment, your content in your silos, and your contents in your grain bin. You do not have coverage for livestock, gas tanks, or crops. And I did do a little bit of research on this when it comes to these types of things. And crop insurance does not cover the loss if it's already harvested. And that's the thing that would fall under the NFIP. So if it's not been harvested, then a lot of times you can have coverage under your crop insurance if they have the multi-peril crop insurance coverage. And this is something that, don't quote me on it, but I'm just kind of telling you guys that when it's been harvested, that's when it's going to fall under the NFIP. When it hasn't been harvested, this is when you might want to, when you do need to look elsewhere to have that crop insurance coverage, because that could have a significant impact on the owner. Livestock losses because of flooding and drowning are not covered by your normal farm insurance policies. And so a lot of times you're going to have a specific coverage that falls for livestock loss or livestock disease, because that's not going to be covered under your NFIP either. All right. Coverage limits. So the program maximums are shown here on the screen. If the building is a non-residential, so when it comes to flood insurance, the use of the building is important. And we talked about this during our commercial training. And it applies here well, since you do often have the dwelling and then your non-residential buildings. For non-residential, the coverage limit is $500,000 and the content limit is $500,000. If it's residential, the coverage limit for the building is $250,000 and for contents it's $100,000. If this is not enough coverage, then they would have to have another policy written on top of that to give them the additional coverage needed. Content only policies are available for non-residential renters up to $500,000 in coverage. Deductibles are also affected by the building type. If it's residential, it can have up to a $10,000 deductible. And if it's non-residential, it can have up to a $50,000 deductible. What you do want to remember is it's always a good idea for the insured to check with the lender before selecting a higher deductible. A lot of times the lender will only allow a certain, they'll have limitations on how high that deductible can be. And what they are required to have. It's a lot easier to make the appropriate selection before than to go back and make the changes afterwards. In the general property form, there is coverage C, and the following coverage is provided under coverage C: debris removal, loss avoidance measures if you know that there is imminent danger of flooding, and that gives you $1,000 in coverage. If you need to remove the property and take it somewhere that's safe from flooding, and this is if there's imminent danger of flooding, there's $1,000 provided for that. And then there's also up to $10,000 provided for pollution damage. And this is going to be when floodwaters contain pollutants or cause a release of pollutants that damages property. It doesn't include, though, testing or monitoring to see the pollutants unless that's required by law.
We had one question in the chat box. Barn dominiums, that's a fun word, would then be covered at maximum of $250,000 since they have a residence in part of the building, but that would actually depend on the percentage of the building that's used for residential versus non-residential. So the mixed use has to be about 75% residential in order to be written as residential on that dwelling.
That's correct.
Okay, and that was the only one. I hope that helped, Molly.
Did that answer your question?
Yes, perfect.
Good. Thank you, Carrie.
Mm-hmm.
All right, the preferred risk policy is also available for agricultural structures. The preferred risk policy is just as it is with dwellings. It's written as a package policy. So the building and contents coverage come as a bundle. The PRP is available for agricultural properties that are located in moderate to low risk areas that are designated by zones B, C, and X. And also for ones that are recently mapped as special flood hazard areas, and those that are designated as zones AR and A99. Multiple coverage combinations are available for both building and contents. And the PRP is written on the general property form. We don't have a special form that you use for a PRP. It's written as general property, and then you just go ahead and indicate that it is a preferred risk policy. For preferred risk, it also has to fall into the criteria of the number of losses that it's had in the property's history, flood losses. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about here is your coverage D, the increased cost of compliance. And this covers expenses that a property owner incurs that are above and beyond the cost to repair the physical damage of the building when it sustains damage from a flooding event. And then they have to comply with the mitigation requirements of the state or the local floodplain managers. You do get a maximum of $30,000 for this coverage. It applies to all property types. The payment and direct loss cannot be greater than the maximum limits of the coverage authorized. And then some examples of this ICC would be you need to elevate the building, or you need to relocate the building to a place that's not as high risk, flood proofing the structure, or demolishing it completely. Those would all apply when it comes to use of ICC. I feel like I went through that information really quickly. Now we have some resources. We will send you, as I mentioned before, the PowerPoint after the session. If you ever have questions when it comes to specific properties, especially agricultural properties, since that's what we're talking about today, please feel free to reach out to us and we can assist you with that and making sure that you're writing the property properly and that you know which buildings have coverage and which do not have coverage. What I found a lot of times with farm ranch, especially if you guys write a lot of farm ranch, you're probably going to be pretty familiar with what you can cover or not. If you haven't written a lot of farm ranch, it usually takes a couple of these different properties and then you really start to understand where there's coverage and where there's not coverage and how to get that coverage for the client. We do have our website, nationalfloodservices.com, where we have a lot of great resources out there. You can sign up to receive our communications at that link that you see there. Our agency development team, me, Carrie, and Courtney are always available to answer your questions. And you can send an email directly to that email address that you see there on the screen, and one of us will respond to you as quickly as possible. And then you've got the Flood Smart for agents and the Flood Smart for consumers. And you will find that there is just a ton of information in that Flood Smart link when it comes to floods and what's needed and losses and all that good stuff. So that concludes our topics for this webinar. And I want to open it up for any questions that you guys may have.
We don't have anything in the chat box right now. Tori, does anyone else feel free to unmute or let us know in the chat box? And as Tori mentioned, if you think of something later, you can always email us.
Yep. We're available, especially since it's December. It's a slower month, so.
Yeah, I don't have anything.
But we're always available. I shouldn't have said it like that. No, whenever you do send an email to us, one of us gets on it right away and make sure that you get a response. Carrie is awesome at making sure that you all have follow-up and you get all the information that you need. So props to Carrie on that.
Thank you. We love our team. We have fun with this. If no one has any other questions, I guess, Tori, what do you think? We let everybody a little bit early, and thank you all for joining.
Yeah, thank you guys. And if you need anything, again, just reach out to us and we're happy to help you. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.